Two friends from old New York town met in a foreign land.
Welcome back to The Place of Places, a chapter-by-chapter analysis of William Saroyan's 1972 memoir, Places Where I've Done Time. Today, we stay at the Hampshire House, New York, 1939. This chapter begins by explaining that for most of the Western world, 1939 was not a good year. The German army attacked Poland, and World War II began shortly after Saroyan's 31st birthday. This is an unusual observation for Saroyan to make, as he doesn't often refer to events outside of his own experience. While America grew into an enormous superpower during his lifetime, his memoirs are thoroughly settled on his own small corner of the world. This can be viewed in two ways: that he was self-obsessed, or that he was, like any other average person, not affected on a day-to-day level by world events. He lived through the Spanish flu and polio epidemics, various American wars, economic collapse, economic boom, the first commercial air travel, first space flight, the advent of movies, television, and countless other 20th century miracles, but most of his writing focuses on small personal scenes. For some readers, this makes him all the more relatable. There are times when he does reference the outside world, but it is not always relevant to the plot of his stories. So this chapter is revealing in that he does make note of his great luck in a year that was, on the whole, pretty terrible for Western civilization. He writes, "But who can experience the agony of others? Who can experience another man's truth?" He certainly took the phrase, "write what you know," to heart, pretty much exclusively writing his own life story over and over. In this same year, 1939, he had seen The Time of Your Life and My Heart's in the Highlands, staged in theaters. And of course, The Time of Your Life would go on to win the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. By this time in his career, he was a star, noted in gossip columns and pop culture articles whenever he published a new piece. He explains that he had left the Great Northern, which we have already discussed in Chapter 29, for a room at the Hampshire House 2 blocks away with luxury amenities overlooking Central Park, and that he felt like a lord. Only 5 years prior, he had become famous. Now he had the money to go along with it. In 1939, he purchased the 15th Avenue house in San Francisco, where his mother and sister Cosette were installed. The neighborhood is called the Sunset District, and though it had been sparsely populated for many decades, it was built up and turned into a streetcar suburb in the 1930s. Up to that time, it consisted largely of sand dunes blown in by the Pacific Ocean. Because the house wasn't yet completed, Saroyan asked the builder, Henry Dolger, to set up an apartment on the basement level for him to write. Dolger was one of the first to create tract housing, an urban sprawl, and he's responsible for the little boxes in Daly City, about which the 1962 song by Malvina Reynolds was written. Saroyan's customization of the house was meant to emulate his house on Carl Street, where he had been prolific. His mother and Cosette were to be given the rest of the house. By 1939, he wasn't living in one single place anymore. He had his roots in San Francisco, but he was in New York also, and tells us that he traveled to Mexico, London, and Paris, jet-setting around and taking full advantage of his new wealth. He was dismayed that the basement apartment on 15th Avenue didn't have a window like Carl Street, but soon found that the fireplace did the same job, and he proceeded to write Love's Old Sweet Song and Sweeney in the Trees there. Though not mentioned here, he also completed The Time of Your Life in that house. But New York was where a young, successful man could enjoy the fruits of his labor, and he was determined to conquer that city in the way that his father didn't. At the fancy Hampshire house, he ate, drank, and fooled around with women, he tells us. And on the 28th floor of the building, he tells us in this chapter, he welcomed an anxious, fleshy young prostitute with a sad story. They chatted, and he took her to Rumpelmeyer's for a snack, sending her home in a taxi. Rumpelmeyer's was a fancy ice cream parlor in the St. Moritz Hotel, famous for its teddy bear decor. Saroyan often wrote of prostitutes with sad stories and hearts of gold. This began back when he was writing the Daring Young Man collection, and was revisited much in the 1930s, with Kitty Duval, the sweet and sad prostitute featured in The Time of Your Life, being his most beloved. In his stories, he liked to write a happy ending for these women, or at least the occasional respite from their sad stories. In The Adventures of Wesley Jackson, written in 1944, the title character meets a young prostitute in London and marries her before she has to turn her first trick. He frequently wrote about redemption and found that these female characters were perfect vehicles for the concept that one's luck could turn around in this crazy world. In his own life, gambling served this life lesson, but in his writing he used other metaphors. He ends this chapter, "It was a very exciting personal time, a very sad world time, and although I was famous and rich at last, I knew it really didn't mean anything." Saroyan always struggled with reconciling his wealth with his poverty-stricken childhood. Growing up poor, he knew the value of a dollar, unlike some of the rich of old New York, including his wife Carol. But he also squandered his money away on gambling, rejecting the high life he had earned for himself. This comes up frequently in this book and in his memoirs. He was unimpressed with other wealthy people and didn't prefer to spend time in their circles. Instead, he slummed around in back-alley casinos and bars, where he felt more comfortable and at ease. But he also appreciated luxury and chose to stay at the best hotels and eat well when he was traveling. There's probably a lot of psychological analysis that can be done here, and much was done in R.M. Saroyan's biography, William Saroyan, from 1983. But we know he was a complicated man with many conflicting emotions from a lifetime of instability. The Hampshire house was a symbol of his success, and he ignored all woe in the world in order to make the most of it. The building opened in 1937, so it was pretty new when Saroyan first got there. It was designed to be a fine post-Depression building and offered amenities to suit it. A plaque in front of it was etched with, "Dedicated to yesterday's charm and tomorrow's convenience." Saroyan was one of many celebrities to stay there, including Greta Garbo, Pavarotti, Marilyn Monroe, Lucille Ball, Frank Sinatra, and others. It was also famously the location of socialite Dorothy Hale's suicide in 1938. At that time, it was common for apartment buildings in New York to offer short-term leases, as well as nightly rentals, while some lived there long-term. While Saroyan was starting to live it up, and he wasn't too far in time from meeting Carol Marcus in New York by now, he continued to write about relatable characters that Depression-era readers wanted to read. In 1938, the famous editor and critic Frank Crowenshield claimed that the modernist writers had finally made fiction accessible to the masses. He said, quote, "Since the war years, the great mass has come into its own. Steinbeck, Saroyan, Hemingway, Farrell have put the common background into literature. Transients, fruit pickers, fishermen, prize fighters, shanty folk are their heroes. The vast populace has become reading-minded." End quote. In the chapter Fame and Fortune and Fun at the Hampshire house, From Sons Come and Go, Mothers Hang In Forever, he begins with, "As soon as I began to be in the money, I took to living like a millionaire, which I had always wanted to do just to see how it felt. It felt fine. There was nothing like it, but I have always had this foolish inability not to notice that not everybody, not even writers, not even good ones, can suddenly get in the money and live like millionaires, and so this knowledge sometimes embarrassed me, and sometimes made me feel a fraud, although I had earned my money the hard way, taking great risks, and never knowing if I could earn a meager living, let alone a fortune. Even after you've won fame and fortune, every time you write, you've got to write. There's no shortcut. You have to start your career all over again." Feeling like a fraud likely made him double down, leaning even further into his playboy lifestyle, and he became known as a loud, charming bon vivant. He had also said that he was only focused and prolific at writing when he was having fun. This usually came in the form of short stories or plays, though he considered writing a novel to be a bucket list item that he needed to accomplish. Most critics would agree that despite his best efforts, the novel form never felt quite right for him, his power coming from his quick pace that he celebrated both in his writing and in his lifestyle. But he admits that the fun of success eventually soured. "In any case, while the flush and fun of success had not yet turned to something like anger and sorrow, I lived like the rich people do, and so I took a suite overlooking Central Park at the Hampshire house, at that time probably the swankiest place in New York, but with real class, everything designed by Dorothy Draper, as I was informed. I even had patent leather loafing slippers, a silk lounging robe, and the very best clothes and shoes. The only reason I didn't have money lying around all over the place was because I had been informed by a man named Pat Duggan, whose mother was a Christian Science practitioner and had both worked and witnessed fantastic miracles, that it was bad manners. Breakfast at the Hampshire house was Cranshaw melon, minute steak rare with O'Brien potatoes, 7 or 8 cups of coffee, with real cream, rye toast, marmalade, and for dessert apple pie a la mode. Total cost about $2. From Sons Come and Go. The reference to Dorothy Draper seems a bit of a joke, since that's the sort of information that he probably really had no interest in knowing, but it certainly helped him come off as posh. Draper was a high-end interior designer with high-class New York pedigree herself. This chapter returns us to his sexual history, like other chapters, and it's always a bit of an awkward motion for Saroyan. But even then, he had begun yearning for a wife and children, feeling that by 30 he had played around for long enough. In those days, I was slim, all nerve and muscle, comedy and laughter, hungry and horny. I read a story years later, by Guy de Maupassant, in which it was said of the central character that upon being introduced to a woman, he was ready to make love to her. But what else? That was how I would have responded had I read that story in 1939. And in my newfound wealth and confidence, I presumed that if any woman I had met at a party phoned, and if she accepted my invitation to come up to 2204 at the Hampshire house, that she understood precisely why I had invited her. And this attitude got him into trouble in those days. Eventually, the Hampshire house became a meeting place for he and Carol, who was only a teenager when they first met. He enjoyed her youthful beauty and vitality, but it was in the Hampshire house where he decided to break it off with her, only to recouple later. In the book, Aram Saroyan explains that a fictionalized passage in Boys and Girls Together, published in 1963, recalls a pivotal event that happened at the Hampshire house more than 2 decades earlier. In it, the Carol character is weeping in the William character's home as he tells her to go. He describes her as a baby and is astounded that she wants so badly to stay with him. Her raw emotion, the kind he can't seem to conjure in himself, convinces him of her authenticity when he had previously doubted it. Aram describes Bill as singularly aloof about these matters, as he had once described himself as a spiritual anarchist. His time at the Hampshire house was sporadic, sometimes able to pay his bills and sometimes not. In 1949, when he and Carol first separated, she lived there with a friend, and then it was the place they reunited in. It was the scene of high times and low, breakups and reunions, seized opportunities and missed ones. But in this chapter, it's about a man trying on identities, basically the theme of the book. Let's put this on the Saroyan map and move on.